Well, we listened last week to Donald Trump's language in his so-called Liberation Day speech, accusing countries of ripping off America, being scavengers. They've raped and plundered the United States. And as countries game out how to respond and even see if it's possible to get tariffs reduced, how do you actually negotiate with a man who uses language like that? And could all of this turmoil result in a global recession? I'm very well. I'm still kind of reeling from what unfolded in the Rose Garden with Trump and his bookies board offering the price on tariffs for this country or that or the other. And it's hard to make sense of it all, if there is any sense to be made.
Well, I wonder if there is. I think we do spend an awful lot of time trying to imagine there's some sort of great secret, clever plan behind all this. But I'm rather drawn to the view of one of our recent guests on the podcast, Michael Wolff, who's written 4 books about Trump. And he said, to understand Trump, you have to understand he's never stopped being a reality TV show. And last week, in a sense, was heaven for him because it was a reality TV show in which there was a different bespoke episode for every single country in the world. And I've been, you say you're reeling. I think most of the world is reeling. I was in Paris end of last week. French media, yes, there was lots of coverage of Le Pen being banned from standing in the election, but actually Trump was dominant on the front pages, dominant on the media. It's the same in Ireland, it's the same in Australia, it's the same in Canada, it's the same in Mexico, it's the same in Asia. And that is where he gets his kicks. And I think the other thing that we last time we spoke, we discussed this fact that Trump term 1, he was surrounded by people who were able to act as a bit of a check on some of the excesses. But Trump term 2, very, very deliberately with this Project 2025 plan, he is surrounded by people who don't, it's not just that they don't stand up to him, it's just that they preempt some of the madness. So you've got people in his economics team, where including you've got J.D. Vance, somebody's dug up something J.D. Vance said in the past about tariffs and protectionism, and this is not the way to build an economy, and it's damaging and so forth. But now, because it's not what Trump thinks, they have just performed a number of complete reversals. So, look, I think that this is as consequential as anything that's happened in recent economic history. And now the question now is whether, well, it's how the world reacts. It's also whether, as a result of some of that reaction, Trump changes course, or whether he just digs in and decides I'm right, they're wrong. And this is, and he starts to believe his own propaganda and his own slogans, which I'm afraid is all too common.
What we were talking about on the program last week is how do you actually prevent this global recession because of the tariffs, while you actually prevent it and maybe solidify all the economies around the world, while convincing Trump that he's actually had a win. Because that's what he needs. He needs to be able to convince himself and his MAGA audience that he's won this particular one.
But this is what's so disturbing about this whole thing, is that essentially the entire world at the moment is kind of having to adapt to the bizarre, twisted psychology of one human being. And you can see, and that tension that you've alluded to, you can see it in the way that Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has been responding to this. On the one hand, there's Keir Starmer, somebody who believes in the rule of law, who believes in rules, who believes in systems, who believes in order, and he sees it being completely upturned by somebody who he has to then nonetheless say things like, well, he's got a point about globalization, or he's got a point about, the way the American economy has been stiffed. And I'm not convinced that deciding your strategy according to the perceived psychology of somebody who's so volatile is the right thing to do. I was very struck yesterday. I've done some, I've been to Singapore quite a few times in my life, and I know the Singaporean Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong. And people should check out, you should maybe have a look at the response he did. They've also been hit by 10% tariffs, the same as the UK, the lowest band, as it were. But he was actually addressing it from a point of principle. He was saying that this is okay, we may escape a little bit more lightly than others, but this is very, very bad for the world economy. And we've really got to sort of steel ourselves for some of the consequences. And likewise with Mark Carney. Carney in Canada, Mark Carney in Canada, seems to have, he definitely has sort of stood up and basically said, we're not going to be pushed around by a bully. And thus far, that seems to have curbed some of the anti-Canadian excesses that we'd been seeing in recent weeks. So, but the point is that it's very, very, your question was, how do you deal with this? It's very, very hard to know how to deal with it when you're dealing with somebody who's prepared to lie on an industrial scale, gaslight on an industrial scale, and have these people around him who are just this media ecosystem of people like, stuff like Fox News and Tucker Carlson, all the Tech Bro podcasts and so forth, who ventilate whatever message he has to say, which, one day it could be black is white and they'll all go out and say black is white.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that you tweeted on Liberation Day, as the world waits to tune into the latest episode of Trumpland reality TV, it's worth remembering that 2 previous episodes in this series, the Gaza ceasefire and the Ukraine peace deal, have not turned out as the main character predicted they would. So,
correct.
Is it the same with episode 3, tariffs?
Well, I think this one's probably too consequential. I'm not saying, by the way, that Gaza and Ukraine aren't consequential. They're massively consequential. The point I was making is that, and this is where I feel that the world's media plays Trump's game for him, and the American media in particular. So, have you noticed how, for example, every Sunday night, Monday morning into our media, we have to listen to some rambling rubbish that he comes out with on the aeroplane back from where he's played golf. Now, to my mind, if you were a proper journalist on that plane, you'd be saying, listen, rather than listening to your effing rambles, can we ask you why you've played golf again? And how much that's costing the taxpayer? Can we ask you why you didn't greet the 4 soldiers that you were meant to do who came back from Lithuania in coffins? Can you actually start to explain to us? Instead of which, what happens is it is the reality TV. They are now, the media that follow him around are like extras in his latest episode. Now, when he had the deal on Ukraine, have you seen him properly pressed?
No. But the point is,
what the details of this deal.
They would probably say, we'll be thrown off the plane if we ask questions like that. Well, they're making a Faustian bargain to stay, if you like, in touch with the man, while maybe despising everything he stands for, but they daren't lose the seat on the plane.
Well, and I understand that to some extent, but listen, and you are dealing with somebody who is completely irrational, totally peevish, and probably would kick them off the plane. But to be honest, I don't know about you, Pat, but I think I would rather be kicked off the plane, preferably after it's landed. I'd rather be kicked off the plane than have to be drawn into what is essentially now just a game that he plays day after day with the media. And the other thing, and one of the worst things that's happened is Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, now edits Prospect, wrote a very good piece yesterday about the abasement, the grovelling. And this started on Inauguration Day. So those people, Musk and Zuckerberg and all the tech people who were there, who are now saying, "Oh, excuse me, look at our stocks are getting wiped out. This is a bit silly." Maybe if they'd stood up to him a bit, maybe if these law firms, rather than caving in and grovelling and saying, "Oh yeah, okay, you might have a point," these TV stations that have settled defamation suits that, frankly, if there'd been a decent justice system, they'd have walked it in court. But what they're all doing is bending the knee, kissing the ring, and the whole thing has the feeling of a sort of a willing walking towards fascist authoritarian dictatorship.
Now, anytime I mention on this program how Hitler came to power, elected to power democratically, and how in a matter of just a few short weeks, he changed everything in Germany and the whole system began to literally bend the knee to his will.
Yeah.
I mean, we're watching the same thing unfold, maybe not to the same holocaustic extent that we saw in Germany, but to certainly the detriment of American democracy. But so many institutions and individuals are bending that knee.
Exactly. And I would recommend to anybody who thinks that. And actually, I did an interview a few years ago now with my old boss, Tony Blair, for GQ magazine. It was a bit weird, me talking to him, doing an interview, but I did this interview. And it was during Trump's first term. And I said to Tony, I said, "Are you not worried that there are just too many parallels between Europe in the 30s and what Trump's doing now, going after media, going after judges, industrial lying, propaganda, etc. And Tony said to me, he said, "Oh, for God's sake, Alastair, get over this Trump is the new Hitler, new Stalin thing." And when January the 6th happened, I texted him a message. I says, "You still think that I'm crazy to think this might be thing?" And I think that. And the other thing I did is I sent him, I strongly recommend your listeners get a book by that Madeleine Albright wrote before she died, and it was called "Fascism: A Warning." And this was a book where she talked about her own journey from Eastern Europe and escaping the Nazis, and then eventually, becoming an American citizen, and then becoming the Secretary of State. An incredible story, but she drew lots of these parallels. And I'll give you another one, which isn't even on the news at the moment in here. I watched last night 60 Minutes on CBS, and there's an account of the Venezuelans, these 200 plus Venezuelans that have been taken from their homes or from their workplaces, put on planes, defying a judge's order that the plane shouldn't fly to El Salvador, flown to El Salvador, and these guys who are now in prison with no sentencing, no lawyers, no connection with the outside world. And this film, it showed one of these guys. He was a gay stylist who'd fled Venezuela because of his political views and being gay and what have you. And because he had these tattoos with crowns on them, and one of the Venezuelan gangs a crown is meant to be a symbol. And likewise, there was a Real Madrid supporter. Well, the Real Madrid team has a crown in its motto as well, and its logo. And these people are now literally shaven-headed, shackled, not allowed to speak, sleeping on steel slabs without any bedding whatsoever, because they've been sent there. And Donald Trump on his plane last night saying that if they could send Americans to these prisons and the El Salvadorians would take them, he'd be very happy with that. I mean, this is just off the scale.
But, you're not even getting the show trials that Putin mounts. I mean, he picks up people off the street and they get a show trial where the result is predetermined almost. We saw Alexei Navalny, the great late leader of any opposition there was in Putin's Russia. But this is from the Nazi playbook. Lift people, no trial, incarceration in some hellhole. That is utterly un-American, one would have thought.
You'd have thought so. And then, but even as you were saying that though, Pat, I was thinking, if one of the MAGA people is listening to that, their response is, you people support terrorists over democracy, or you people support drug dealers over good, honest, decent American people. I must say, by the way, Pat, I was in France the other day, and I was in the hotel at breakfast and flicking through the papers, and it was actually the story that really got me going was a story in the Figaro, which said that the European diplomats in NATO were starting to have conversations about whether Europe needs to have a completely new defense structure because NATO can't sort of survive with the Americans pulling out of our security in the way that they're doing. And I was just sort of effing and blinding and what have you. And this woman leant over from the next table. She was American, and she said, "Can I just say something to you?" And she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry." And she went on about how she was in Europe because she just had to get away. She and her husband just had to get away from America. They couldn't bear it. They were from a Republican state, Missouri. But so you have to remember this. Trump is not America. And you saw those demonstrations over the weekend, way bigger than anything Joe Biden ever provoked. And so there is a fight back. There is a fight back. But the point is, if you look at what Putin, and you made the comparison with Hitler in the 30s, Trump is moving way faster in terms of the courts, in terms of the media, in terms of the way that they're attacking universities. There's all of this stuff that is happening at a pace that we have to be very, very careful about. And this lady actually said to me, look, our last hope is going to be the midterms. And, there's so many things that
by then
unimaginable.
he will have interfered with the electoral system to almost ensure his victory. But there are some straws in the wind that might give hope. I mean, besides the protests on the streets of America yesterday, and they were enormous in Boston, New York, and Washington, and possibly elsewhere. There were demonstrations around Europe as well. But there are three things I wanted to ask you about. Senator Rand Paul, diehard Republican, leading the charge against the tariffs. RFK deciding that the MMR vaccine is the best way to prevent measles, and China really cleverly turning the screw on the United States.
Well, just on the Kennedy one, I mean, this is how crazy things have got, Pat. You're basically saying, let's celebrate the fact that a senior American politician with one of the most important jobs in the world has finally accepted that the world is not flat. So that is, yes, you can say that's a good thing, but but
what it means is when public pressure mounts about something, that they have to respond. In other words, when children are dying in Texas, and he's going to the funeral of the first child who died, I believe.
Okay. Well, fair. Well, and that relates to something else. That you see, I think that there are a lot of questions for the Democrats about how they allowed themselves to be defeated, and one question you could ask is why did the Democrats lose somebody like Kennedy so that he could then be exploited? You could actually ask the same question about Elon Musk, who can then be exploited by somebody like Trump. And I've got no doubt at all, there's no way that that cabinet of nodding dogs that sat there as he was doing his, as you say, his bookie's cardboard cutout show, there's no way that they're all going to last the course. There was a brilliant piece in the New York Times recently by Thomas Friedman, and he said that he talked about, of none of these people got mirrors, wives, husbands, daughters, because he basically made the point that most decent people, if they're looking at the mirror when they're shaving in the morning, they are going to think, oh, can I really put up with this much longer? Have they got no wives, daughters, family members who are saying to them, what this is happening to our country now is disgusting, you must not be part of it. That will start to happen. It will take time, but it will start to happen. And I think the point about China is fascinating because, of course, we are so, if Trump has a genius, it's his ability to dominate the media agenda around the world. And, we're talking about him again. We're doing the podcast tomorrow. We'll be talking about him again. He is dominant on the world agenda. However, the fact is that I said this on the podcast a few weeks ago. I asked Rory Stewart if he could name any members of the Politburo. There's the top 7. The people who run China. Now, everybody knows about Xi Jinping, president for life, but the other 6, and I'll be honest, I've forgotten their names already. I only knew them because I had them in front of me. But we talk about, everybody knows now who Hexeth, the Pentagon guy, is, who Rubio is, who Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, is. So we discuss America as though it's the only show in town. Meanwhile, China, its economy is probably already bigger. They have, again, sorry to keep going about the New York Times, Thomas Friedman wrote another piece recently where he said that, he'd just been to Shanghai and seen this amazing 35,000 engineers at this new AI center in Shanghai. So they are, when they hit back with their tariffs, they know that it's going to damage their economy, it's going to damage the world economy, but it's about them making clear to the rest of the world, we're not scared of America. We're going to go our own way.
They play the long game. And Trump responded to their imposition of reciprocal 34% tariffs on top of anything else that's already there. China played it wrong. They panicked. The one thing they cannot afford to do. Now, this is quite a considered response from China because in addition to that blanket figure of 34%, they're saying they will place restrictions on the export of rare earths, which, of course, are vital for many industries, weapons as well as electric cars. And they have put sanctions on individual companies with which Chinese companies will be, American companies, that Chinese companies will be forbidden to do business with. So it's quite clever.
Yeah, but the other thing, of course, is that because Trump talks such nonsense about, well, pretty much about everything, but on tariffs, he keeps saying to people that as a result of these tariffs, essentially, he presents it to the American public as this will mean that these countries have to pay more money to us to get their goods into our markets. But it's not. It's the Americans who are going to have to pay that. And what that means is that there was a very interesting thing I was listening to yesterday, American economist, who was explaining that these electric cars in China, BYD, which are, and he said most people in America have never heard of them because the tariffs are already so high that they can't get into the market because it doubles the price. But actually these cars are better than Teslas, they're cheaper than Teslas, and what this will lead to is China developing their markets for BYD cars in other parts of the world. They'll worry less about America. And I think you'll see that. I thought it was very interesting. I mean, I'm sure there are all sorts of complicated factors behind the decision. But when Jaguar Land Rover announced on Friday, I think it was, or the weekend, that they were going to suspend exports into the US market, which is a huge market for them, to assess how they were going to respond to this. I'm sure part of that will be saying, okay, well, we're going to have to step up our game elsewhere. And the way that guy, Howard Lutnick, who, Trump's Commerce Secretary, the one who was sort of holding up the cardboard bookies show for him. I mean, he talks about these. He did an interview yesterday. He was talking about, his vision of the Chinese economy is incredible. He says, instead of having these millions of people who are using little screwdrivers to put their little bits of their screws into your iPhone, we'll be doing that in factories in America. Their vision of the rest of the world is so divorced from what's actually happening in the real world. And I think eventually, this is the thing that I think will eventually do for Trump, that is going to catch up on them because the real world ultimately will assert itself.